Our next presentation, Motus Wildlife Tracking System. Amanda Dillon.
All right. Morning.
Good morning.
Switching back, I'm determined to use up the bulbs in these projectors. So.
I like it.
Also, I'm not tech savvy enough yet to use the touch screen. So animals move. This is something we know. They move for a lot of different reasons. They move to go from, a place that they maybe spend the winter to a place where they go to breeding. They follow ocean currents or climates to find areas of high food quality. And sometimes they move short distances. Our corners, for example, maybe we're lucky if they move 200 meters over their entire lifetimes, to birds, which can fly from one pole to the other. And this movement is important. A lot of times we think that the most important areas for animals are where they're breeding. And that is really important, the continuation of the species. But they wouldn't be able to do that if they didn't have suitable habitat in these areas where they're not breeding and in those corridors between those two areas. And so scientists have done a lot of work to study the movement of animals. And we use a lot of different tools to do that. And I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about each of these in detail and some faults of each of these. So the first one is marking. So marking, sometimes we don't need to mark animals. Some animals have unique coat patterns so that we can identify individuals. And then we can re-encounter them just by observational study. So scientists can go out and look for them and observe them, or we can put up passive camera trap arrays so that we can locate animals and watch how they move across the landscape. If animals do not have unique markers, well, we can give them unique markers. So that's what we do at our bird banding stations. We give the birds federal bands that have unique numbers on them. So we're giving that bird a license plate or a name so that we can identify it. Those bands are usually small. That's this small band here on this prairie warbler. So in most cases, it requires re-handling. So that can really only happen if these animals are encountered by other researchers who set up the mist nets or capture the animals to read those bands. If we, or in the case of our prairie warbler in Florida, we can have the public encounter them, but usually that's not a happy ending. We can add some auxiliary markers if we wanted to, like in this case on this prairie warbler, we've added color bands so that we can identify that individual from a distance. So we don't need to re-encounter it or handle that bird in order to find out what its name is. We've done this with collars on wildlife. They've even put paint on animals and then used camera traps at night to study their movement, giving each animal unique paint colors that are only visible from UV light. And finally, stickers. I mean, really low tech. But these stickers are actually, this is what scientists use to find out where monarchs were migrating to. It's how scientists found their overwintering grounds in Mexico. So the marking works. It's a lot of work by scientists, and it does require that you re-encounter the animal, which might work on a small scale for us when we have researchers out here in the pine bush looking at prairie warblers in the breeding season. But if we want to connect the prairie warblers to where they're wintering or the corridors that they're using to go from their breeding grounds to their wintering grounds, it kind of doesn't have much utility. So the next one is radio telemetry. So this we've been using for years. You put these transmitters on animals. You may remember Beast. She was our 16-and-a-half-year-old doe that was equipped with a radio collar by the DEC in 2002. So you equip these animals with collars that have a radio transmitter on them. And that radio transmitter has a unique signal. And you use a receiver and an antenna, so a Yagi antenna, to locate that signal. It takes a lot of work on the ground. It can be one person that kind of does a lot of walking around to triangulate and pinpoint where the animal is located, or you can have a number of people on the ground with these antennas to find these animals. The problem with this is that, again, it has a limited range. So this is really where we're studying home ranges or breeding ranges. We can't really follow an animal over a large distance with this because these radio transmitters have limited distances that they can reach. They're also limited by the batteries. So scientists are always waiting. We want these teeny tiny batteries that last forever. That would be great, but we're not quite there with the technology. So basically, the smaller the battery, the less time the device works. So some of the smallest radio transmitters we have for animals, we can put on some small animals like smooth green snakes or prairie warblers, but they only last about a month. So again, that's going to really limit the amount of movement that we're going to be able to document. And it's also really labor intensive, so it involves a lot of scientists being out there, or a lot of time for very dedicated scientists to follow these animals. So GPS transmitters are a great tool. This is a big step in allowing us to follow animals over larger areas. So these are transmitters that you attach, and instead of using a radio signal, they actually communicate to satellites. And so they get a GPS fix, and you program these GPS transmitters to take a certain number of points a day, or to take them at a certain time of day, and it gives you a location for that animal. And they're really great. If you want to spend double the amount of money, you can actually get ones that will transmit that data back to you via a website. But in many cases, you have to recapture the animal to get that GPS tag off in order to download the information. So it does, again, require that we re-encounter the animal. And again, we're really limited by the battery size here. These GPS trackers require a lot of power because they're communicating with these satellites. And so the smallest GPS trackers that we can have right now only last about 45 days. So again, we're really limited by this battery problem with wanting to study animal movement. So these light level geolocators are kind of fairly new, and we put them on prairie warblers. You may remember Steve talking about this. So they're essentially little data loggers. It's great because they don't have a big battery in them, so you put them on here in the breeding season, we let them go, they fly down to their wintering grounds, hopefully they come back, and we recapture them, take that data logger off, and we're able to get the data off of it. So again, requires that we re-encounter the animal, but it gives us an incredible amount of data. These have a small light sensor on them that use the length of day and the position of the sun to figure out where they are on the planet. So really great tool. As you may remember from Steve's presentation, there's a lot of post-processing with this data. It turns out that shrubland birds that spend a lot of time in shrubby areas in the shade, that really impacts those light readings. So it makes the data really messy, and it takes a lot of post-processing to actually figure out where those animals were. You might remember from Steve's presentation, when we knew these animals were here on the breeding ground, we got some signals like way up in Canada, out in the Atlantic Ocean. So there's a lot of post-processing, and it does require that we recapture the animals. And we did find with our research with these birds in particular that putting these geolocators on did affect the return rates. So all of these work to some degree, but nothing's really perfect. And here's Motus, which is also not perfect, but it's getting a lot better, and it's a really great method for monitoring animal movement. So the Motus Wildlife Tracking System is a collaboration of a bunch of different organizations that put these Motus towers up and use them as a passive array to study animal movement. So this is our Motus tower on the top of the Discovery Center here. And I talked about those Yagi antennas before with radio telemetry. This is the same thing. They're just giant Yagi antennas. They're 9 feet long. There are 4 of them up there pointed in each cardinal direction. And so what that is doing is animals are equipped with radio transmitters, but they're very, very small because we don't have to worry about tracking them over small areas. These transmitters, they're called nanotags, emit they're on the same frequency, so all these towers can pick them up, and then embedded in that frequency is information about that particular individual. So this program was started in Canada in 2012. It was a project of Acadia University, so it was very small scale. And then it got a real big bump in infrastructure in 2015. It's a program of Birds Canada, and you can see these yellow dots are where Motus stations are currently located. I just downloaded this map last night, so it's really focused on North America. We are starting to get some of these stations in South America, which is great because that'll help us learn. A lot of our birds that breed here are going down to South America for the wintering months. So that's great, and we're also seeing them start to appear in the Western Hemisphere, or sorry, the Eastern Hemisphere over in Europe and Australia. So I'll just zoom here onto the northeast. So you can see when this program started, it was really focused on coasts. And that was one of the reasons it took us a couple years to kind of get on board. This bug was actually put in my ear by our avian field technician, Tom Williams, who thought this was a program we might want to tie into. But at the time, the program kind of hadn't reached critical mass, and I think a lot of scientists were still hoping that the batteries would catch up and we would have a better method. But since I've learned about this program, the number of towers has really just exploded. And you'll notice especially here, actually I'll just zoom in a little bit. In Pennsylvania, they have here this, what they call a fence. So basically, these are all the MOTUS towers. Those little flower shapes are each antenna has a range of about 20 kilometers. And so basically, a bird equipped with a MOTUS nanotag cannot fly over Pennsylvania without hitting one of their towers. So I'll talk a little bit more about that, but here is our station here in Albany. You can see we're kind of ahead of the game a little bit in New York. So we've got some stations over in Montezuma, down at Cornell, and up at Braddock Bay, but we're really kind of ahead of the game here in New York State. So I go up every once in a while and I download the data. So those Yagi antennas are connected to a small computer, and those antennas are working 24/7, 365 days a year. So they're just waiting to detect a signal of an animal flying over that's equipped with one of these tags. And so these 4 bars here are our 4 antennas. So the white is usually an interruption in the signal, but it can also mean that the antenna is pointed in a very quiet direction. So antenna 1 here is actually pointed at the Heidelberg Escarpment. So I believe that it's functioning okay, it's just not getting a lot of interference. And so the computer actually interprets that as interference. But what we really want to pay attention to are these 2 little circles here. These are detections of animals flying over our tower. And in order to learn more, we reference these project names on the left side of the chart there. So I'm just going to go to the website real quick to show you some of the data. The website is really great. A lot of the projects that are participating in MOTUS make their data available to the public. And so you can actually click on and see examples of these animals moving across the landscape. So this is an example of 30 gray-cheeked thrushes and 7 Swainson's thrushes. This is actually from 2016 also, so you can actually see the yellow dots popping up on the map as more MOTUS towers are added to the network. And we have even more MOTUS towers now. So this is the kind of information that we're able to get, without having to recapture these animals and remove data loggers, without having to worry about battery power. We're able to get this kind of migration information. So one of the birds that we detected recently was from this project with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. It was a red knot, which is an unusual bird. Certainly not something I thought would fly over the Albany area. I pretty much figured they were coastal species during migration. So really interesting. And what's really cool, especially, is when we click on this, we can actually find where this bird was originally banded. Yeah. So this bird was banded off the coast of South Carolina. This if we look at a table, see that this bird was picked up by 4 other MOTUS towers. So these 2 in May are up in Ontario, Canada. So that's probably when that bird was heading up to the breeding grounds in the Arctic. It hit our tower in August of this year. And what's really interesting and kind of cool, I think, is that that same day hit a tower in Connecticut. So that bird was really booking, definitely on a southward migration. So to date, our tower has picked up 6 species. So we put that tower up in August of last year. So in September of last year, we picked up a Swainson's thrush. That's not completely unheard of. We definitely catch those at our fall migration station pretty regularly. A rusty blackbird in November. This is an SGCN in New York. We have documented it in the preserve before, but not very regularly. An ovenbird coming through this spring, didn't stick around, kept going north. Another weird shorebird flew over, a semi-palmated plover in July. Shorebirds migrate earlier in the year than a lot of our passerines, so that's not unusual. And we got a tree swallow in July, and then finally in August we got that red knot. So we can click on the projects for each one of these. Most of these are projects that are looking at migration patterns and migration stopovers for these species. Many of them, the Swainson's thrush, the rusty blackbird, the ovenbird, the tree swallow are all out of Canada, projects out of Canada. And then, as I mentioned, the red knot is a Fish and Wildlife Service project. I'm not sure about the semi-palmated plover. So this is a really great program that we've put into. It's really putting us on the map for this project. And we're really kind of a leader in New York State. I mentioned that fence before in Pennsylvania. So that was an effort of the Northwest MOTUS collaboration, which is a bunch of groups getting together and trying to facilitate these towers getting built across Pennsylvania in order to create that fence. They're continuing that work into the Northeast, including New England and New York. I spoke with some of the representatives at the Eastern Bird Banding Association meeting this spring, and they are aware of our station, and our station might kind of end up being one of the eastern anchors of the fence in New York State, which is pretty exciting. So it's a very low energy project for us, but puts us on this map for this broader research project and is helping us learn even more about how the pine bush fits for the migration of many species. So I'll be happy to take any questions.
Amanda, what's the antenna and hardware cost for the station?
All together with the computer, so the computer box and the antennas was probably $1,500 to $2,000.
I'm surprised there's not more private, birders, that's pretty low cost. And some of these folks are so passionate that $1,500 is not.
I should say ours was a little bit cheaper because we were able to tie right into the power here. If you want to put one like out in a field somewhere where you don't have a power resource, you have to get like a solar panel, and so there's a little bit more involved. We also had a structure existing to put ours on, so it costs more money if you need to build a structure to put the MOTUS tower on. So that price can vary quite a bit, but yeah, it's low cost up front, and then it's very low maintenance.
Are we seeing if the birds are stopping here or just flying over?
So this is just flyover. I've since learned that MOTUS towers are really good at looking at birds flying over. They're not so good at looking at birds below the towers because there's a lot of signal interference. And so for us in particular, this program is better at looking at migration. If we want to look at stopover, I'd hoped to use our MOTUS tower to look at saw-whets, to see if our saw-whets were sticking around in the area, but it doesn't seem like that's the best use of MOTUS because there's so much signal interference when they're sitting in the pines and in the vegetation. They're just not picked up as well by the towers. So these towers are really more focused on movement, documenting movement.
What does the bird have on it?
So it looks really similar to it looks very similar to the Geo Locator that we had on the prairie warbler. It's just a little bit smaller, but it kind of does that same thing. It attaches like a little backpack, goes over the legs and sits on the rump.
How long does it last?
It lasts, that's a good question. I think they last a very long time because it depends how often, what frequency you set them to ping at, but I think they last a very long time. I'm not 100% sure.
Amanda, did you say early on that when we ban or some way, shape, or form one of these birds, it affects their ability to come back? You said it affects their retrieval?
We did find an effect of geolocators. Steve, I'm right? Okay, thanks. We did find that geolocators, not the bands, but the geolocators, we found, so when we did that study, we put geolocators on 25 birds and we put just color bands on 25 birds, and we looked at the return rates of those two groups.
Yeah, okay.
And we basically saw an effect of geolocators. Whether or not that's affecting the birds and their mortality, causing mortality, we don't know. It's possible that they just got scared away and they went somewhere completely different and we were able to relocate them. So we're not sure what that effect is. At this point, we just know that it affects whether or not they come back to the pine bush.
It wasn't like a death, that wasn't like a death sentence. We got a bunch
No.
of birds back then and had the geolocators on them. They
Yeah.
just returned at a slightly lower rate than the birds without geolocators.
And I should say, I was going to mention, so our recaptures during the breeding season, Neil mentioned, these birds do have high site fidelity. It's high quality habitat, and so our recapture rate in the summer during the breeding season is about 8 to 9%, which is pretty high relative to other stations. But our fall migration station, let's see, okay, I had a picture of her. Our fall migration station, it's much lower. So this Tennessee Warbler was captured in 2017, and she was a recapture. So we originally banded her in 2016, and we caught her almost to the day and in the same net that we caught her the year before. That was our first migrant recapture, and Neil has been banding migrants here since 2007. So it took 10 years for us to re-encounter a migrant. So it is hard sometimes to re-encounter these animals, especially if you want to study migration. It's real hard to re-encounter them.
Any other questions for Bill? Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.